Morning, everyone. So this morning we are on to chapter 22 of The Wizards of Once, knock 3 times, 22, inside the mouth of the Nukkalevi. There was chaos inside the mouth of the Nukkalevi, darkness and a terrible rushing noise, like a roaring, churning, bellowing tide. The Nukkalevi is trying to swallow us! Hang on as tight as you can! Shouted Wish. She and Zar were using all their energy to cling on as hard as they could to Crusher's rope while they swung wildly this way, that way, turning somersaults, doing backflips, losing all sense of what was up and what was down. The sprites had lost their lights in the confusion as they rattled all around. Down below them, the Nukkalevi's second set of jaws had opened, the ones hidden down at the bottom of his throat, and if they had dropped through those, they would never get out again. Crusher, the great long-stepper high-walker giant, hung on grimly, one great arm clasping the ropes Wish and Zar were holding, the other one gripping the inside of the Nukkalevi's mouth. He was desperately trying to keep hold on both as the Nukkalevi shook his head this way and that, and the gigantic muscles of his great gullet tried again and again to swallow them. "I can't hold on any more," thought Zar as the rope shuddered and swung chaotically. And just as Wish was beginning to lose her grip and was about to be jolted off the rope entirely, the Nukkalevi stopped shaking his head. Because while Zar and Wish and Crusher were being jangled about like stones in a bucket, on the outside of the Nukkalevi's mouth, Bodkin was being thrown about this way and that just as violently as they were on the other end of Crusher's rope. He had a brief moment of panic as he looked down and remembered, "Oh yes, I'm dangling 100 feet up from the jaws of the Nukkalevi, and my friends are actually inside the Nukkalevi, and it's my job to save them." The rope had stopped shaking and was now swaying gently from side to side in a way that was really quite drowsy, making, "Oh no, it was happening again." "Don't fall asleep!" cried Caliburn, flopping around in frantic circles because there wasn't a lot he could do himself while he was in bird form. "The one thing you mustn't do right now is fall asleep." Caliburn was right. Bodkin was never going to be a hero if he kept falling asleep in a crisis situation. He had to stay awake. So even though the familiar woozy feeling was coming over Bodkin, this time he fought it with every fibre of his heart and soul. "Wake up!" Bodkin said to himself sharply as his eyelids drooped. "Wake up now! This is your chance to be a hero! Think!" The reason that the rope had suddenly stopped shaking was because the Nukkalevi had lost sight of Bodkin. The last the monster had seen of the boy who didn't take his shoes off was down on the beach, running towards him. But the boy had disappeared. Was he really a wizard and not a warrior, as the girl had claimed? Had he used some magical object to turn himself invisible? Maybe he was a scarier opponent than he had looked. The Nukkalevi's 13 eyes swiveled in all directions looking for a boy. No sign. The Nukkalevi hated getting out of the water. His bulk was much too big for that. But this was an emergency. He dragged the front half of him out onto the beach to get a closer look at the crevices high up into the cavern. No boy. Where had he gone? Bodkin, meanwhile, had thought of a plan. My dogs, as you can hear, are howling in the background. Bodkin swung the rope back and forth, as though he was on a rope swing, until he hit the side of the cavern wall. He hung there for a second, before kicking off with such force that he and the rope swung all the way round the Nukkalevi's chin, past the creature's ears, on the other side, and he landed on the Nukkalevi's snout. The Nukkalevi suddenly remembered the rope dangling from the outside of his mouth. He tried to look down, but his 13 eyes were perched right on top of his head, and he couldn't see under his chin, which is why he missed seeing Bodkin, who was now standing on top of the Nukkalevi's nose. The staff that Bodkin was holding only did one thing. It was a staff that stuck things to other things, remember? You might have thought that this was quite a limited spell. It certainly wasn't one of the flashier, more spectacular ones, like mind control or invisibility or transformation or shape-shifting. But sometimes it isn't the spells themselves that are important, it's the clever way you use them. Bodkin used that spell intelligently now. He touched the staff on one of the Nuckaleavy's nostrils and, squirch, the nostril closed in on itself as one side of the nostril stuck itself to the other side. The Nuckaleavy tried to snort through it and, squirch, Bodkin touched the staff on the other nostril and it closed up too. Still holding the rope, Bodkin launched himself off the Nuckaleavy's nose with as much careless recklessness as if he had been Tsar himself. Round the other side of the Nuckaleavy, Bodkin fell, so that the rope had wound itself in a circle all the way round the Nuckaleavy's head. And when Bodkin swung back down to the bottom of the circle, he touched the staff to the rope, and it stuck tight. The Nuckaleavy tried to breathe through his nostrils, but they would not unblock. The Nuckaleavy tried to open his mouth that he had been keeping closed so firmly. But his mouth would not open. The Nuckaleavy was part of a crocodilian family of monsters that had great strength in the muscles that grasp prey, so they exert extraordinary force when they are keeping their jaws shut. But the muscles that open the jaws are far weaker. So weak, even they cannot break through the rope of a long-stepper high-walker giant. And then there was chaos in the cavern of the Nuckaleavy. The Nuckaleavy's 13 eyes bulged and blazed with absolute incandescent fury. He thrashed about in the underground lake with Bodkin desperately hanging on to the madly jerking rope. Lightning bolts shot off the Nuckaleavy's tentacles as his enormous body swung this way and that in the jangling mass of curses bottles. But however hard he thrashed, the Nuckaleavy could not catch his breath. The Nuckaleavy knew that when the Nuckaleavy knew he was beaten. And still the dogs bark. The jerking of the great monster's body became weaker and weaker, and now that he knew he was vanquished, the Nuckaleavy was dignified in defeat. He lay his head down quietly on the beach and closed all 13 of his eyes and resigned himself to death. After all, he had broken a promise to Tsar and Wish that he would not close his jaws while they were taking out the stone, and he had promised by mistletoe magic, may his own life be forfeit. That is a very solemn promise, and you break it at your peril, so the Nuckaleavy must have known he was risking the wrath of fate. Bodkin dropped onto the beach when the Nuckaleavy laid down his head. He unstuck the rope that was tied under the monster's chin, and the Nuckaleavy's jaws relaxed, and his mouth opened. Inside the throat of the Nuckaleavy, the world stopped rocking for Wish and Tsar. Crusher pulled them up, and they slipped and slid out of the hope and mouth of the Nuckaleavy, the stone held tight in the palm of Tsar's hand. "You were brilliant, Bodkin," said Caliburn admiringly. "You're a hero. You should have seen him, Tsar and Wish." "You saved our lives. I knew you'd be a hero when the time came," said Wish. "Didn't I say it?" Tsar shook Bodkin's hand. "Yes, Wish was right all along. You are a hero, Bodkin." It was a magnificent moment for Bodkin. Tsar bowed to Bodkin and then clapped him on the back. "Here, you take the stone and complete the bargain, because if it wasn't for you, we would never have got it." Bodkin thought he was going to burst with pride. Wish proud of him. Tsar bowing to him. Bodkin. He had overcome his fear. He hadn't fainted or fallen asleep. He had acted like a hero. And most importantly of all, he hadn't been an idiot for coming here. The jealousy of the betrayal was forgotten and forgiven. The quest had been a success in the end, all because of him. He stepped forward importantly towards their fallen opponent. He bowed, because that is the polite and gracious thing to do to a defeated adversary. Bodkin held up the stone. "Nuckaleavy, I'm so sorry that I offended you by forgetting to remove my shoes when I landed on your island. We have answered your question. We have completed your task. You said to us, here is the stone that has been worrying you for the last 20 years. Now you must complete your bargain and give us 4 of your scales." The Nuckaleavy opened his 13 eyes wearily slowly. You have the scales already. Oh, that is completely the wrong answer. You have the scales already, said the Nuckalevy. What do you mean we have the scales already? Said Tsar, bewildered. No, we don't. You can't try and trick us again. Tsar reached out to take 4 of the Nuckalevy's shining scales, but all at once the cursed bottles with the name Encanso exploded into little pieces. They ducked so as not to be hit by flying glass, and the scales exploded off the outline of the Nuckalevy. They tried to catch the scales, raining all around them, but the scales slipped through their fingers, burning bright silver for a moment before they faded and seemed to melt into the beach. But the Nuckalevy seemed somehow happier without his scales. Younger, even, he shone like a star in the cavern, glowing white as coral. It was as if a spell had been lifted, and the beast had awoken from a trance that bound him. A moment earlier he had seemed like he was on the edge of death, barely breathing. Now he seemed reborn. Thank you for breaking the riddle and the curse of the Nuckalevy, said the scaleless creature before them, still weak, but gathering strength in front of their eyes. A great sweep of the Nuckalevy's tail toppled the treasure heap, as if he no longer cared for the treasure any more. Magic boots and caps with wings and singing swords went bouncing around the cavern in lunatic directions. Tsar and Wish and Bodkin had to throw themselves on the ground to get out of the way, as arrows made of moon, and horns of plenty spewing out food, and harps playing themselves in a cacophony of noise flew around the cavern in mad, eccentric circles. Oh dear, moaned Caliburn. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear! All the magical objects are escaping! Sure enough, the 7-league boots were marching up the cavern walls and then right out of the cave itself, running away as fast as they could, followed by magic staffs of indescribable power, golden shields of destiny, and all manner of other dangerous objects that ought to be kept safe and guarded and out of human reach. But worse than this, much worse than this, the Nuckalevy turned and dived into the darkness of the water, and then the Nuckalevy swam away and out into the open sea. Shielding their faces with their arms, Tsar and Wish and Bodkin watched him go with open mouths. What just happened? Said Tsar. He's gone! The Nuckalevy is gone, but more importantly, where are the scales? They dropped to their knees on the beach, but the last remains of the Nuckalevy's scales slipped through their fingers like mist. The Nuckalevy had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. And after all that work, after Tsar and Wish rescuing Bodkin and Bodkin rescuing Wish and Tsar, they had failed nonetheless. No scales. The last ingredient in the spell to get rid of witches had gone forever. And believe it or not, there was worse to come. With a magnificent sweeping flourish, the enchanted sword finally drew itself out of its own scabbard and placed itself into Bodkin's trembling hand. Behind them, in a dark corner of the cavern, there came a horrible creeping hiss of a whisper. Foolish, creaked the voice, to go on a quest without knowing the rules yet. They rolled around and out of the darkness, out of the heap of dark treasure the Nuckalevy had been guarding. There rolled, trapped in a ball of iron, the King Witch. And that's the end of that chapter. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Have a lovely day.